argue with a dead man. You can't lift his head from the mud, wipe the mud from his eyes, and wrangle with him over kings and empires, proletarians and popes. Ask his opinion of a red star or a crooked cross, and he'll not tell you. No stars shine in his dark sky, his only cross the index to his grave, and he'll not know of that. These words are the first lines of a poem by John Quinn, The Argument, which has long been one of my favorite Australian poems. It was written in World War II, but the questions that it raises are very much the same questions that we face as we come together to commemorate Anzac Day. There is a temptation on an occasion such as this to want to glorify the courage and tenacity, the contributions of servicemen and women, and to make heroes of those who died in war. But we as Australians are less susceptible to this temptation, because instead of celebrating some glorious victory, we come together to lament the loss of lives in a very horrible and bloody battle. 99 years ago, on the 25th of April, a contingent of Allied soldiers, including some Australians and New Zealanders, sailed into the Bay of Gallipoli. The Turks were waiting for them. The story that I was told as a child was that the beaches were mined, that the surf was full of barbed wire, and that in the ridges above the bay, the snipers were waiting. More than 500 men died that day. The water was red with blood and chock full of the bodies of the dead and wounded. To mitigate the horrors of this story, I was also told the story of the retreat of those soldiers a few months later. One of the things they did was to rig up a system where rifles fired automatically. They had tin cans, and there were holes in the bottom of the can, and so the water would drip from one can into the can below it. And that can was attached to the trigger of a rifle. So when that can was sufficiently full of water, the rifle would go off. This meant that as the troops withdrew and fewer men were left to refuel the rifles, the enemy had no understanding, no knowledge that the troops were leaving. And the story goes that not a single life was lost during the retreat. At dawn services around the globe this year, Australians came together again to think about that morning, to remember those who died, and to reflect on the lessons of Gallipoli. It is therefore a time of solemn remembrance, of sadness, and of contemplation. It's also a time to say appropriately that war sucks. War is a waste. It's a waste of energy, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of resources, but more importantly, it's a waste of life, of love, of hopes, and of dreams. As John Quinn goes on to say in his poem, now you want to argue with him. You want to say, you died for something great. Wasn't it worthwhile to die for something great? Wasn't it? The causes for World War I have been discussed and debated for over a century now. And I'm not here to remind you of why Australian and New Zealand men were fighting a war in Europe. But one thing I think that we will agree on if we talk about war, and that is that the decision to go to war is made at a political level. And the reasons why people fight has everything to do with power. One group trying to maintain or grab power from another group. I've spoken to soldiers, to returned soldiers from World War I, from World War II, from Vietnam, and from other conflicts. And they all agree on one thing. They have the same hope, that we can build a world where we can resolve our conflicts without going to war. So our feelings about war and about those who served in war for our country are mixed. We acknowledge their courage and valor. We remember and think about those atrocities and things that they experienced. And we acknowledge their sacrifices. But more importantly, we acknowledge the contribution that they made and the legacy that they have left. We as a nation and a people have been changed, have been shaped by the contributions of those people who served our country. For those who died in war, that service was cut short. But for those who survived and returned home, that service continued in thousands of ways. Returning soldiers built RSL halls, which serve as community meeting houses. They raised money for memorial swimming pools and parks, where future generations can relax and reflect. But more importantly, they raised families. And they continued to serve their country and community in many different ways, as farmers, teachers, engineers, researchers, religious leaders, just to name a few. So, what is our response to the story of Gallipoli and to the sacrifices of those people who have served our country in so many ways? We must work to build a world and where we work for peace. We must try to convince our leaders to resolve their conflicts through dialogue and negotiation rather than through armed conflict. We must learn about other nations and other cultures. We must respect the humanity and the dignity of all people. This might be a daunting task, but nevertheless, it is the only way that we can respond with integrity to the stories of history and to the sacrifices of those Australian men and women from every generation. Lay his head in the mud again. Wipe the blood from your hands. You can't argue with a dead man.